Didn't scream. I didn't throw anything across the room. I just stood in my own kitchen, holding a dish towel, and watched my daughter-in-law pour herself a glass of my sweet tea like she owned the place. Because, as she saw it, she did. That was the moment I knew something had to change. My name is Gloria. I'm 63 years old. I live in Savannah, Georgia, and I spent the last 11 years of my life making sure my son had everything he needed to build a good one. A real one, the kind his father and I never had when we were starting out. Marcus was my only child. I want you to understand that before anything else. Not because it excuses what happened, but because it explains why I held on so long. When you pour everything into one person, your time, your savings, your prayers, your whole heart, it's not easy to accept that the person looking back at you isn't who you thought they were. His father, Raymond, passed in 2014. Pancreatic cancer. 8 weeks from diagnosis to gone. We didn't even have time to fight it. After that, it was just me and Marcus, and I told myself that holding our family together was the only thing Raymond would have wanted me to do. Marcus was 31 when his father died. Old enough to handle it. Old enough to step up. And for a little while, I thought he was going to. He had a good job in commercial real estate over in Atlanta, made decent money, called me every Sunday. I thought we were going to be okay. Then he met Destiny. I'm not going to say Destiny ruined my son, because Marcus made his own choices every single step of the way. But I will say that from the moment she came into our lives, something shifted. Something I couldn't name at first, couldn't put my finger on. She was polished. Beautiful. The kind of woman who walked into a room and immediately assessed what everything in it was worth, including people. The first Christmas she came to my house in Savannah, she spent the whole dinner on her phone. When I brought out the sweet potato pie I'd been making since Marcus was 6 years old, she looked at it and said, "Oh, I don't really do sugar." That was it. "No, thank you." "No, it looks wonderful, Gloria." Just that. And Marcus laughed like it was charming. I told myself I was being too sensitive. They got married in the spring of 2019. I spent $18,000 on that wedding. Not because they asked me to, Marcus asked me to. He came to me about 6 months before and said they were having trouble covering everything and could I help. Destiny's parents were contributing what they could, he said, but her family didn't have much. I found out 2 years later that her parents had a second home in Hilton Head, and her father drove a BMW, but that came later. I wrote the check. I told myself it was a gift, not a loan. I told myself that's what mothers do. After the wedding, things were fine on the surface. They lived in Atlanta. I stayed in Savannah. We had holidays together, and I learned how to navigate Destiny, how to compliment her outfits, how to not bring up money, how to laugh at things that weren't funny. I became very good at that, shrinking myself down to a size that didn't make her uncomfortable. What I didn't know was that Marcus was struggling financially. Badly. I found out in pieces, the way you always find out things you weren't supposed to know. First, there was the phone call in February 2021. Marcus called on a Tuesday, not a Sunday, which should have been my first signal, and told me he'd been passed over for a promotion and things were a little tight. He needed to borrow $4,000 to cover some expenses while he figured things out. I sent it the next day. He said he'd pay me back within 3 months. He never mentioned it again. Then that summer, I noticed he'd stopped posting on social media. Marcus used to post all the time, pictures of him and Destiny at restaurants, weekend trips, that sort of thing. Then nothing. When I asked him about it, he said he'd just gotten tired of it. In September of 2021, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. A man on the other end asked if I was the mother of Marcus James. I said yes. He told me he was a financial counselor working with Marcus and Destiny, and that they were looking at some significant debt consolidation needs, and was there any chance I'd be willing to speak with him? I hung up. Then I called Marcus. He took 4 hours to call me back. When he did, his voice had that particular flatness I'd come to associate with conversations he'd rehearsed beforehand. He said they'd gotten in over their heads a little. Credit cards mostly. A personal loan they'd taken out to renovate their condo. He said it was fine, they were handling it, he just wanted me to know in case anything came up. I asked him how much debt we were talking about. He said around $42,000. I sat down on my porch steps and looked out at my yard and didn't say anything for a long time. I want to be honest with you. I should have stopped right there. I should have said, I love you, and I'm sorry you're going through this, and you are going to have to work this out yourselves. That would have been the right thing. That would have saved us all a great deal of pain. But he was my son, and I had the money. Raymond's life insurance, my retirement savings, the equity I'd built up over 20 years in the house I'd bought by myself after he passed. I had resources. And Marcus didn't. Not right then. So I told him to come to Savannah the following weekend and we would sit down together, the three of us, and figure out a plan. Destiny didn't come. Marcus showed up alone and said she had a prior commitment. I thought that was strange. I found out later she'd refused to come because, and I'm quoting what Marcus eventually told me, she didn't want to feel like she was being lectured. I gave him $25,000. I told him it was to clear the highest interest debt and get them breathing room. I wrote it out as a personal loan with a repayment schedule that I typed up myself. He signed it at my kitchen table with a cup of coffee in his hand, and when he left that afternoon, he hugged me for a long time on the front porch and said, I don't know what I'd do without you, Mama. I held on to that hug for a long time afterward, longer than I should have. They didn't make a single repayment, not one. I waited 6 months before I said anything, because I didn't want to be the kind of mother who hovered. When I finally brought it up at Thanksgiving, gently, privately, just me and Marcus in the kitchen while Destiny was in the living room watching TV, he told me they'd hit another rough patch, and could I just give them until after the new year? I said okay. After the new year became after tax season. After tax season became after summer. I stopped asking. I told myself I'd forgiven the debt, and I needed to let it go. What I was really doing was avoiding the conversation, because I was afraid of what his face would do when we had it. In the spring of 2023, Marcus called to tell me they'd found their dream home. A house in a suburb north of Atlanta, 4 bedrooms, good school district. He was so happy on the phone. I hadn't heard him sound like that in years. He asked me to co-sign the mortgage. I told him I needed to think about it. I thought about it for 2 weeks. I talked to my sister Lorraine, who lives in Charlotte, and she told me flat out not to do it. I talked to my friend Beverly, who I've known since we were in our 20s, and she was quieter about it, but her eyes said the same thing Lorraine's mouth did. I did it anyway. I told myself he was my son. I told myself Raymond would have done the same thing. I told myself this was the last time, that this would stabilize them, that once they had the house, they'd get their footing. I co-signed. The mortgage was $412,000. They moved in that June. I drove up to help. I brought house plants and a set of good cast iron skillets that had been my mother's. Destiny walked through the house pointing out what she was going to change. The light fixtures, the backsplash, the landscaping, like she was on a design show. She didn't say thank you, not to me, not once in the whole weekend. Marcus kept catching my eye and giving me this small, apologetic look, like he knew. Like he'd always known and had just decided that knowing was enough. I drove back to Savannah on Sunday evening and cried the whole way down I-16. For the next several months, things were quiet. They settled into the house. Marcus texted more than he called. Destiny started a lifestyle account on Instagram. Home decor, fashion, intentional living, whatever that means. I followed it. I watched her post about the new countertops and the reading nook she built, and the dinner parties they were having, and I thought, well, at least they seem happy. Then in January of this year, Marcus called me on a Wednesday morning. I was in the middle of pruning my rose bushes in the backyard. Something about the Wednesday morning call made me set down my clippers before I even answered. He said he needed to talk to me in person. He drove down the next weekend alone again. Destiny was, as Marcus put it, not feeling up to the trip. He came in, sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where he'd signed that repayment agreement 3 years ago, and he told me that they were behind on the mortgage, 3 months behind. He said there had been some issues with his job. He'd actually been let go in October and hadn't told me, and they'd been trying to manage on Destiny's income, which wasn't enough, and they'd run through their savings, and he needed help. He needed me to cover 5 months of mortgage payments to get them caught up and give them a buffer. He'd already talked to the lender. He had the numbers written down on a folded piece of paper that he slid across the table to me like we were in some kind of negotiation. $21,400. I looked at that number for a long time. Then I looked at my son. He was 41 years old, sitting at his mother's kitchen table with a folded piece of paper, asking her to fix it. I asked him why he hadn't told me he'd lost his job. He said he didn't want me to worry. I asked him what Destiny thought about him coming to me. There was a pause that lasted just a moment too long. He said she thought it was the right move. I found out the truth about that particular statement much later. I told Marcus I needed a few days to think. He nodded, like he'd expected that, and he ate dinner with me and we talked about other things, and when he left he hugged me again on the porch. Not as long this time. I sat with it for 4 days. I prayed about it. I called Lorraine. I pulled out every document I had. The unsigned repayment agreement, the co-signing paperwork, the bank records showing the $4,000, the $25,000, the wedding check. I laid it all out on my dining room table, and I sat there looking at it like it was evidence. Because it was. On the 5th day, I called a real estate attorney named Carol, who I'd been referred to by Beverly's husband. I told her my situation. She listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. When I was done, she asked me a few questions about the co-signing arrangement and the mortgage terms, and then she told me what my options were. I want to be careful about how I describe what happened next, because it took several weeks and involved paperwork and conversations that were not simple. But the short version is this. As a co-signer in default, I had certain rights, and I intended to use them. What Marcus didn't know, what he had no way of knowing, because he'd never bothered to read the fine print of the agreement I'd co-signed, was that there was a co-signer protection clause that, under conditions of missed payments and borrower hardship, gave me significant legal standing with respect to the property. Carol explained it to me clearly. She explained what I could do and what I couldn't do, and she told me it would take about 6 weeks to execute properly if I wanted to do it right. I told her I wanted to do it right. During those 6 weeks, I told Marcus I was still thinking. I sent a check for 1 month's mortgage payment to keep the lender satisfied and buy time. I was pleasant on the phone. I asked about the house and pretended to admire Destiny's Instagram posts and called on Sunday like nothing had changed. What had changed was everything. The thing no one tells you about reaching your limit is that it doesn't feel dramatic. It doesn't feel like a breaking point. It feels quiet. Like a door closing softly in a room far away. I had spent 11 years bending myself around my son's needs and his wife's comfort, and I had finally just stopped. Not in anger, not even in grief, just in clarity. I remembered something my mother used to say. She'd say, "Gloria, you can love someone and still put the money down." I finally understood what she meant. On a Tuesday morning in late March, while Marcus was at a job interview in Midtown Atlanta, he'd texted me that morning to say he had a good feeling about it, and I'd texted back a prayer hands emoji. I was in Carol's office signing the final documents. The property was being transferred into my name alone through a process that was entirely legal, entirely documented, and which Marcus had, without realizing it, made possible when he signed the original co-signing agreement 3 years ago. The lender had agreed to a modified arrangement given the default status and my impeccable credit history. Carol had handled everything with the precision of someone who had seen this particular situation before and felt not one moment of hesitation about it. I drove home to Savannah in a kind of silence I hadn't felt in years. Not empty silence, full silence. The kind that fills your chest up instead of hollowing it out. Marcus called me that evening. He'd gotten the second interview for the job. His voice was lighter than it had been in months. I said that was wonderful. I meant it. He found out 4 days later. I don't know exactly what happened in that house when the notification came from the lender and Marcus started making phone calls and realized what had occurred. I know that he called me 7 times in a row on a Friday afternoon, and I let every call go to voicemail because I was not ready to have that conversation on his timeline. I was going to have it on mine. He showed up at my door on Saturday morning. I'd expected that. I'd also expected that Destiny would be with him, and which was actually the first time in quite a while that she'd made the drive to Savannah. She did not look like she'd built a reading nook or hosted a dinner party or practiced any intentional living that morning. She looked like a woman who had spent the night calculating what she'd lost. I invited them in. I made coffee. I sat down at my kitchen table, in my house, in my name, and I let Marcus talk. He talked for a long time. He covered everything: the shock, the betrayal, the legal questions, the accusation that I had deceived him, the question of where they were supposed to live now, the anger that kept cracking through the hurt in his voice like something he couldn't quite contain. Destiny sat beside him and didn't say anything, which surprised me. She just watched me with those careful, assessing eyes. When Marcus was done, I waited a moment. Then I got up, and I got the folder I'd left on the counter, and I set it on the table in front of him. The repayment agreement from 2021, still unsigned on his end. The bank records. The wedding check. Every document from every time I had helped, and every time help had gone unanswered. I didn't say much. I didn't need to. The paperwork said it. What I did say was this. I told Marcus that I loved him and that I would always love him, the way you love someone who was your whole world for a long time. I told him that I had spent 11 years giving and giving and giving from a well that wasn't bottomless, and I was done pretending it was. I told him that the house was mine now, legally and completely, and that I intended to sell it, but that I was not turning them out into the street. I would give them 60 days to make arrangements, which was more than fair and more than the law required. Destiny asked me, very quietly, if this was about her. I looked at her. I said, "This is about me. For the first time in a long time, this is entirely about me." She didn't have an answer for that. Marcus sat there for a while after that, not talking. There's a particular kind of silence that happens when someone sees clearly for the first time, when the picture finally resolves, and they understand that the problem wasn't the last thing that happened. It was every single thing that came before it. I watched it happen on my son's face, and it was the saddest and most necessary thing I have ever witnessed. He cried eventually, not performatively, just quietly, sitting at my kitchen table, the way people cry when they're not trying to get something from it. I put my hand on his arm. I kept it there. Destiny left the room. I heard her walk to the back porch, and I left her there. That was 4 months ago. The house went on the market in April and sold in 23 days. The real estate market north of Atlanta is what it is, and Carol had advised me well on the timing. After the mortgage was settled and the fees were accounted for, I had cleared enough to put a significant sum back into my retirement account and set aside a separate amount that I had a specific plan for. Marcus and Destiny are renting an apartment in Decatur now. He got the job. He's working. He called me on Mother's Day and we talked for 40 minutes. And it was the most honest conversation we'd had in years, maybe ever. He didn't ask me for anything. He just talked to me. He told me he was sorry. Not the reflexive kind of sorry. Not the sorry that's really a preamble to a request. Just sorry. I told him I knew. I also told him what I'd done with part of the money from the sale. I'd opened a custodial account for his daughter, his and Destiny's daughter, Amara, who is 4 years old and has her grandfather Raymond's eyes and has not done a single thing wrong in her whole sweet life. I put enough in that account that if it grows the way my financial advisor believes it will cover a substantial portion of her college education. Not Marcus's debt, not Destiny's lifestyle, Amara's future. Marcus was quiet for a moment when I told him that. Then he said, "Mama, you didn't have to do that." I said, I know. That's why I did it. I'm sitting on my back porch right now, writing this out, watching the Spanish moss move in the afternoon wind, the way it's moved my whole life. The rose bushes I've been tending for 15 years are coming in good this spring. The house is mine, has always been mine. Feels like mine again in a way it stopped feeling for a while when I was too busy managing everyone else's piece to tend to my own. My mother used to say that the most dangerous thing a woman can do is convince herself that being needed is the same thing as being loved. I convinced myself of that for a long time. I wore it like it was a virtue. It wasn't a virtue. It was an habit, and habits, even the ones that look like love, can be unlearned. I don't know what Marcus and Destiny's marriage looks like now, behind their apartment door in Decatur. That's not mine to know. What I know is that my son called me on a Sunday for the first time in months without needing anything, and that Amara's account is growing, and that I slept 8 uninterrupted hours last night for what felt like the first time in 11 years. Some people, when they hear a story like this, want to know if I feel guilty, if I regret it, if I worry that I was too hard. I think about that question honestly, and then I think about a woman standing in her own kitchen, holding a dish towel, watching someone else pour sweet tea from her pitcher, and saying nothing, because saying nothing had become the only way she knew how to keep the peace. I am not that woman anymore. That's the only answer I have. It's enough. People ask me sometimes if I think Marcus knew. Not everything, not the full picture, but enough. Enough to look the other way. Enough to keep coming back to my kitchen table with another folded piece of paper and another explanation that almost made sense if you didn't look too closely. I've thought about that question for a long time, and what I've come to understand is that it doesn't actually matter, because the person who knew everything, every dollar, every unanswered repayment, every Sunday call that ended with a gentle ask, was me. I knew. And I kept choosing the same thing, expecting a different result. That's not love. That's a pattern. And patterns don't break themselves. What happened with Marcus and Destiny wasn't a single event. It was a long accumulation of small choices, mine as much as theirs. Every time I said yes when I should have said, let me think about it. Every time I let an unanswered repayment slide because the conversation felt too hard. Every time I watched Destiny walk through a room she didn't build and didn't thank anyone for, and I told myself I was being too sensitive. I was building something, just not what I thought I was building. I was building a dynamic where my generosity had no floor and their accountability had no ceiling. That's not a family arrangement. That's a system. And systems produce exactly the outcomes they're designed for. The thing about living with integrity is that it costs something. Real integrity, not the kind you talk about, but the kind you practice when it's inconvenient and painful and the person on the other end of it is someone you love. That kind has a price. I paid it late. I wish I'd paid it earlier, when the bill was smaller. But I paid it. And there is something clarifying about finally doing the hard thing you've been avoiding. Something that strains your spine in a way that nothing else quite does. I think about Amara, 4 years old, Raymond's eyes, not a thing in the world her fault. That account I opened for her is the truest thing I've done in years, because it's love without strings attached to anything her parents did or didn't do. It's love aimed at the right place. That's what I want her to know someday, when she's old enough to understand any of this, that her grandmother loved her cleanly, without an agenda, without a ledger. Strength isn't refusing to feel things. I felt everything. I cried on I-16 and I sat with those documents on my dining room table, and I put my hand on my son's arm when he cried in my kitchen. Strength is feeling all of it and still making the decision that your life requires you to make. Wisdom is knowing the difference between holding on because something is worth holding and holding on because letting go is something you haven't yet figured out how to do. I'm 63 years old. The roses are coming in. The house is mine. And I am, for the first time in a long time, exactly where I decided to be.